Alright, so recall that the identity theory of mind had some responses to the dualist critique of it. But then when we look closer at two different versions of the identity theory, type and token identity, they both had problems of their own. Not raised by the dualist. So today we're going to look at a theory of the mind called functionalism, which tries to solve those problems that plague the identity theory of mind while retaining the strengths of it. So recall that the token identity theory avoids the problem that the type identity theory had. A Martian can be in pain and yet have goo instead of a brain on the token identity theory. But of course that can't happen on type identity theory. However, we want an account of types of mental states. That is, we'd like a unified account of mental state types. Telling us that a mental token M is identical to a brain token B doesn't promise much in terms of a unified theory of mental states. We want something that we can give us predictions, that can tell us, that we can reconcile with other areas of science, and not just science, but just a philosophy in general. I mean, we want, something that's lawful, and you don't get that with the token identity theory. It's not very informative. Further, respectable, sane, intelligent philosophers rule out identifying mental states with behavior. For Carl's being in pain isn't Carl's jumping up after sitting on a tack, even though Carl's being in pain caused Carl to jump up after sitting on a tack. So, the behaviorists are right insofar as behavior is intimately connected to mental states, but they're wrong when they identify behavior with mental states. There's something internal that goes on, and denying that doesn't solve any problems. Denying the data isn't the same thing as explaining the data, and the basic data that we have to deal with is that there's internal goings on, stuff in the head, mental thingies, that we have to have an explanation for. And we want that explanation to kind of, lawfully explain behavior at the same time. So philosophers seek an account that can explain how mental states are causally and lawfully related to behavior. Additionally, our mental states are often related to other mental states. So in addition to mental states being related to outward physical behavior, they're related to other internal mental states. So think about this. Take Homer running from a tiger. His running from a tiger was caused by his fear of tigers. So his behavior was caused by his mental state. But Homer's fear of tigers, a mental state, is in part caused by Homer's belief that tigers are dangerous. So one mental state is the cause of another mental state. And many mental states are caused by and cause other mental states. So we want a theory that explains that connection between mental states as well as the connection between mental states and behavior. So take Homer's belief that tigers are dangerous and take the input, he sees a tiger. Well, that mental state that tigers are dangerous plus the input causes in turn this further mental state, this fear of tigers, which then causes this behavior, the output, shrieking and running. So mental states can serve as the inputs for other mental states. And okay. Fortunately, it just turned out that the tiger was a bad dream. Alright, so the desired theory then will identify, in some sense of the word, mental states with some physical state or other. But it can't do it in the way that a token identity theorist does it, and it can't do it in the way that the type identity theorist does it as well. Well, how are we going to get this in? Well, we're going to restrict ourselves to materialism for now. That just seems to be the easiest way to account for the causal connection between mental states and sensory output on one hand and behavioral output on the other. Because we have a pretty good idea how physical things can cause other physical goings-on. Perhaps it's a bit more mysterious to explain how mental, non-physical things can causally interact with physical going-ons. So, for now, we'll, okay? So, what this suggests is we shouldn't be concerned so much with the particular material involved, but instead what the material does, its functional role. So it doesn't matter if it's a brain or if it's goop, if it's a neuron or if it's a microchip. So yeah, those would be examples of different types of materials. But instead what we're concerned is not with what it is, but what it does, okay? So it's not that it's made out of, cells or goop or silicon. Instead, it's that it's what it's doing causally. Like, all right. So then, being afraid of tigers is whatever state, doesn't matter what material it is, but whatever state causally mediates between having light from a tiger hit the retinas, being conscious of the tiger, believing that tigers are dangerous, and the behavior of shrieking and running. Thus, we should understand types of mental states functionally. So they are whatever states take certain inputs, such as sensory stimuli, relate causally to other mental states, and then yield certain outputs, behaviors, or other mental states. Okay, does this make sense? So it doesn't matter what the material is, as long as it plays the proper functional role. This is the view that we call functionalism. And this theory combines the strengths of behaviorism and identity theory. And as a brief aside, I suspect that a lot of modern cognitive science rests on this functionalist framework, which I'm about to explain. So remember I said that a lot of neuroscience, not saying that the field of neuroscience is committed to it, but I suspect that a lot of neuroscientists and a lot of neuroscientific theorizing perhaps rests on this identity theory of mine. Well, I'm thinking similarly for cognitive science, I suspect that a lot of it is kind of assuming a functionalist understanding. Now, I don't want to represent the whole field that way, or in the individual cognitive scientists, but this is just my suspicion, and I think it's a well-grounded suspicion based on, work I've done. I actually used to work in a cog-sci lab back when I was an undergrad. Okay. So with behaviorism, then, when I recall I said it combines the strengths of behaviorism and identity theory. Well, with behaviorism, functionalism acknowledges that mental states have a relational nature. Carl's being in pain is something that mediates Carl's sitting on the tack and Carl's jumping and shrieking. So, in one sense, we want to say that Carl sitting on the tack is what caused Carl to jump and shriek. But, and behaviorists gets that right. There is, this connection between the outward stuff. But then with identity theory, functionalism holds that mental states mediate causally. They kind of play the causal role or the link in the production of behavior and mental states being produced by certain inputs. So mental states are kind of that missing link between sitting on the tack and jumping and shrieking. Okay? It's a missing piece of the puzzle. Well, again, I've stressed this numerous times and I want to stress it again. Functionalism isn't strictly a materialist theory. Recall I said it doesn't matter what the materials are as long as they play the right functional role. Well, there's a sense in which it doesn't even have to be something that's physical. It could be something non-physical that plays a functional role as well. Functionalism is not committed to materialism. It's consistent with materialism, but it is not committed to it. So functionalism can be true and materialism can be false. It is also possible that functionalism is true and materialism is true. They are not inconsistent, but they also aren't dependent on each other. Dualism tells that materialism is false. Materialism tells that dualism is false, but functionalism does not. So then, given that what stuff plays the appropriate role doesn't matter, the view is compatible, again, with dualism and the existence of states of mental substances performing the appropriate functions. However, most functionalists prefer a materialist version of the theory to some mysterious non-physical mental substance. So most of them perhaps are still materialists. Alright, well, let's talk about functional roles then some more. To be a functional role, generally, is to be in a certain state and take inputs and yield outputs. Taking an analogy from life. Biologists, so I'm told, used to think that life was this distinguishable substance that wasn't identical to the organism, but somehow the organism possessed, like a vital fluid. So when you died, your vital fluid vacated you. Okay, it left the body. That's what makes a corpse, is it doesn't have any more vital fluid in it. This was a view called vitalism, and it has now been discredited for obvious reasons. And instead, biologists, being much more sophisticated and having learned a lot, now they consider life to be a property that objects of many kinds can have, provided their parts perform certain functions. So they have a functionalist understanding of life. The buzzer's done. My clothes must be dry. So, for example, repairing and sustaining themselves would be a function, procreating is a function, and then a thing is alive if its parts, doesn't matter what kind of stuff they're made out of, as long as its parts are engaged in certain specified activities or perform certain specified jobs. So, This is an example of functionalism at work in the sciences and biology. Well, consider another application. Consider a soft drink machine that provides a bottle of soda for 10 cents. If only soda were cheap, that cheap these days. Unfortunately, it's gotten quite a bit more expensive. But we'll go with the example, okay? So the machine has two states it could be in. If the machine is in state 1 and you insert only a nickel, then it goes into state 2. If the machine is in state 1 and you insert a dime, then it stays in state 1 and dispenses a soft drink. If, when it is in state 2, you insert a nickel, the machine dispenses a soft drink and goes back into state 1. When the machine is in state 2, if you insert a dime, the machine dispenses a soft drink and a nickel change and returns to state 1. So here's a little table between nickel and dime input, and then the different states could be in. And this is just a restatement of what was on the last slide. State 1, nickel input, no output, and goes to state 2. State 1, dime input, dispenses a soft drink and stays in state 1. State 2, nickel input, dispenses a soft drink, goes to state 1. State 2, dime input, dispenses a soft drink and a nickel and goes to state 1. Alright, this is pretty basic stuff. This is, go to the basement of beering on campus and, soft drinks behave in roughly the same way, only now they're like $2 for a drink. But, you get the, I hope you get the idea. Alright, so this is important. Again, we have said nothing whatsoever about what those states are states of, be it mental, physical, plastic, metal, silicon, or goo. Instead, what's important is that the right, proper relations hold between the inputs and the outputs. For example, in a soft drink, it's that the right relations hold between the dimes and nickels and the soft drinks in other states. So we could then crudely think of state 1 as being the machine's desire for a dime, and state 2 as being the machine's desire for a nickel. And when you satisfy the machine's desires, it dispenses a soft drink. So the soft drink machine then is an example of something that philosophers call a Turing machine, which is something popular in the field of artificial intelligence research. And a Turing machine is anything that can be specified in terms of a machine table, like the one on the previous slide, that, like a software program for a computer, indicates what the machine will do. For example, go to a certain state and give a certain output upon receiving a certain input and being in a certain state. So to the functionalists, the mind is software, and I mentioned this in another presentation, but to the functionalists, the mind is the software and the brain in humans is the hardware. And just as Windows can run on a lot of different hardware, so a mind can be realized in a lot of different, quote, hardware configurations. It can be realized in the human brain. It can be realized in Martian goo. It can perhaps be realized in a circuit board. Okay? So functionalism is a view then, here's a way of thinking about functionalism's answer to the mind-body problem. According to functionalists, the mind is the software and the brain is the hardware. So minds can be run on many different hardware platforms, and the human mind just so happens to run on the human brain. Pretty simple analogy, but I think it's pretty powerful, and it goes a long way towards perhaps making progress in the mind-body problem. So, let's say a bit more about functional roles then. According to functionalists, thinkers are very complicated Turing machines. So mental states are functional states that are defined according to the relations to sensory inputs, behavioral outputs, and our mental states. And as a result, functional states can be realized in many different sorts of material. Well, this is where it gets disturbing. According to functionalists, thinkers are very complicated Turing machines. So we're all machines. I don't think of myself or my wife as a machine or my parents as a machine. You may not think of yourself as a machine, but if functionalism is true, that is what we are. So we are all data.